Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Brian. So we'll jump right in, I guess. Hopefully everybody's settled down and ready for a good 40-45 minute overview of NAV. So what we're going to cover today is suitable for really anybody that has to deal with customers that want to get into NAV warehousing. So that's, pre-sales or salespeople, consultants that need to talk to your customers about, what they need from a warehousing perspective. It's sort of an intermediate to beginner level. So we can cover some of the advanced topics if we have questions on that, but really this is focusing on a general overview of how you can set up NAV to run a warehouse and what are some of the considerations. So if you're in a pre-sales engagement or even a consultant on site and you're not that familiar with warehousing, what questions do I need to ask? What considerations are there when we're talking to customers about how to set up warehousing? Now, we're not going to cover off any of the InsightWorks products on this particular webinar. If there are questions, if you know them and you have questions about how they might interact or work with the base NAV warehousing stuff, feel free to ask. But there's a webinar coming up. There's a slide at the end that'll give you the dates and details on the actual products that now build on top of the base NAV stuff. But what we're focusing on today is strictly standard NAV functionality. As Brian mentioned, interactive. Be as noisy as you like. We've got you muted, so we don't care. But raise your hand, not real physically. We don't have the webcams on, so I can't see you. But click the button to raise your hand, or type in your question at any point. You don't have to wait till the end to ask questions. I prefer if we ask questions, when those questions are topical. So feel free to interrupt and ask those questions. All right. So the goal of the session, as I mentioned, really is to cover off, what is this NAV warehousing thing? What are the options there? What's basic versus advanced? We hear those terms quite a lot. How you can configure it. What are the different impacts based on the physical processes that the client has? Those types of things. So we're going to go through that and hopefully cover all this off in the next 40 minutes or so. So a little bit, we'll just go through the agenda, a little bit about us, and then we'll cover off those various topics that'll hopefully help you understand and get through those session goals. So first about us, just so you know who you're dealing with. For those of you who know us, you know all this stuff. We're based in Canada. We have offices in the US, Australia, but primarily in Canada. Most of our installs, we have close to 500 installs now, mostly North America, but some European, Australian installs. And we have a number of reseller partners, which many of you are. And if you're not, feel free to contact us to get signed up as a reseller for some of the products. Those products are here. So we have a number of other little tools and things like that we often, give to partners if they need it, enhanced planning worksheets and things like that. But these are our primary products that we deal with. I'm not going to get into them in a lot of detail because, again, we want to focus on the warehousing side. But the Warehouse Insight is the tool that sits on top of the base NAV warehousing to give you mobility and a number of other functions and features on top of NAV warehousing. The other one I'll quickly mention is the NAV Extender product. That is completely free. Gives you document drag and drop into NAV. You don't actually have to modify anything in NAV to be able to use it. So you run a little installer, and after that, you can drag and drop files, emails, whatever you want into NAV. Okay. A few sample clients for InsightWorks. So of course I chose all the big guys here that we deal with, but we work with anything from people running the starter pack with 5 licenses all the way up to guys that have 500 licenses, and various products fitted to these various industries and customers. But again, if you have any questions about the products or anything else, contact us after this session. All right, so let's jump right in. So quite often, we're doing these types of sessions in person, and I yell out, what does WMS mean to you? What is that term? And when we say WMS in the NAV world, most people think of the NAV advanced warehousing when we say WMS. They say, oh, we're not running the WMS in NAV. And I say, well, do you have bins? Do you have pick tickets? And they say, yes. And I said, well, WMS is warehouse management system. you're using a system to help manage your warehouse. You are running WMS, but that's not really, so that advanced warehousing, most people conflate that with the word WMS. That's not entirely true. You can have a WMS, a warehouse management system, in NAV without turning on that advanced warehousing in NAV, and we'll look at that in a moment. So NAV does have basic and advanced warehousing options, and really it's a bit of a, when we say basic warehousing, that's not entirely true, because the basic warehousing in NAV means we haven't turned on one checkbox that turns on directed pick and put away. Basic warehousing can actually get fairly complicated. There's a lot of different options. In some ways, it's almost more complicated than advanced warehousing because of all the different ways you can configure the system. So you can mix and match a whole bunch of different options in basic warehousing. I did air quotes there in case you didn't see that. We've got, a lot of different options we can set up with basic warehousing that actually makes it fairly complicated, right? And as I mentioned, in some cases more than the advanced warehousing. And then when we get into advanced warehousing, there's also a whole bunch of options in advanced warehousing beyond that one checkbox that enables it. So, what happens when people come to us and they're looking for, a warehouse management system, or, what they think of a warehouse management system, which is enabling mobility in the warehouse, they really don't know how they're going to set up NAV to make that work. They don't know the different options available. They don't know what the impact of turning on that directed pick and put away is. And that's what we're going to cover here. So the question again I'd like to ask interactively is, how many ways can you configure a NAV warehouse location? And by that I mean, if I go in, do I have two options, basic and advanced, right? Which is what a lot of people sort of dumb it down to. Or do I have multiple options? Well, Microsoft, if you read the Microsoft white paper, so if you go on to MSDN and do a search for, warehouse design details or warehousing white paper or something like that in MSDN, it'll come up with a Microsoft white paper. It used to be a PDF, and now you can just get it on MSDN. And they basically list out 6 different levels of complexity in the warehousing side. So they're saying there's 6 ways you can set up NAV for warehousing. Well, they lie. That's not entirely true. There are 6 basic categories, but within that, you can basically turn on and off each of these checkboxes independently to a large extent. And with that, you've got dozens, literally dozens of different ways you can configure a NAV warehouse. And each of those different ways has a significant impact on how people have to use the system. One checkbox makes a very significant difference in, for example, whether you have a regular pick or a 2-stage pick. Okay. So why do we have all of these different configurations in NAV? What's the point? Why can't I have, basic warehousing and advanced warehousing, 2 checkboxes or something like that? Well, the reason is because we have to match what people are doing physically in the warehouse to the virtual world of NAV. So, the only reason we want NAV and have NAV is so we can extract data from it. And we need to make sure that that data is in there appropriately. And the easiest way to do that is to mimic the physical world inside NAV. So in other words, if I have a physical process that has 3 steps in it, I would probably want to mimic those 3 steps within NAV so that I can match what people are doing physically. So the best approach, the thing that I normally recommend when people go in and configure their warehouse and configure NAV to match that warehouse, is define their best practice physical processes. So by that I mean, for example, if I have a shipper that is also the picker, well, it doesn't make sense to have, what we call a 2-stage pick, where I first pick, drop it off, and then I do a secondary activity to ship it. That makes no sense. It's the same guy. He's grabbing it, he's putting it in a box, and he's shipping it all in sort of one step. Right, so that's the first thing, is identify how the people in the warehouse are going to ideally work, and then choose the configuration in NAV that's going to match that physical process. Right? And if there's anything you take away from this session, it's probably those 2 key points. Figure out how they're going to work physically, map that into NAV through the various configuration options in the location card. All right. I always want to say, anybody have any questions about that? But you probably don't yet. All right, so let's start with the basic stuff. Now, many of you might be aware that there's this thing called directed pick and put away, and that's this checkbox down here. If we turn that on, it basically prevents us from messing with these other checkboxes. But with that off, we can turn these checkboxes on or off and have a lot of different combinations of options. And they work somewhat independently, but they also work jointly to control the behavior. So rather than sit here and stare at this little screen, what I'll do is I'll jump into NAV and we'll actually walk through some of those options so we can see what they might be. So if I come in here and I go into my locations, so I'll start with the blue. These are all just the standard NAV, demo data. I'm in Cronus, Canada, but the Cronus database. And I'm just going to open up my blue location, and we'll look at the warehouse options. So the first thing I'll mention is, the bulk of the scary stuff is in these checkboxes here. That's what's going to really have the biggest impact. Then after these checkboxes are turned on, there's a number of other, options that you can set. So you can set policies and bins and all sorts of other things. So these are sort of secondary considerations for when you configure the warehouse. But these guys are your key. So I'm just going to run through what they do, give you a little explanation of what each thing does, and then move on. So the first one, require receive. Hey, look at that. NAV is doing my work for me. It popped up a little tooltip there that tells you exactly what that does. So require receive, what it does is it enables warehouse receipts. And what that does is segregate, the PO or the transfer or the sales return from the source document. So now the warehouse guys have a warehouse receipt that they use. They don't have to look at the PO. They don't have to look at the transfer order, that type of thing, to do a receipt. So that's one, and segregation of duties. You've got warehouse guys that have their own special little place that they can play in, and they don't see the other stuff. The other thing is it allows you to batch orders together, so you can have multiple POs, for example, on the same receipt, or multiple transfers on the same receipt. And the opposite of that, it allows you to split up a PO into multiple receipts as well. So, for example, you've got a PO with 4 containers on it. Each warehouse receipt could represent a container. That's a fairly common approach we use. The shipment does the same thing. So when we say require shipment, what that does is it creates a warehouse shipment. So instead of shipping from a sales order or transfer, we have a separate document in NAV that's a shipment that allows us to segregate, again, the duties for shipping into that, and also allows us to batch orders, so we can do multiple orders on the same shipment, and we can also split up orders as well, kind of like the receipts. Then we get require put away, which is kind of a weird place to put that checkbox, but require put away is more like allow put away. So if we don't have any other checkboxes turned on, that allows us to use an inventory put away. So if, for example, if I went in here and turned this on, which I'm allowed to do, it doesn't yell at me to be able to turn that one on if I haven't used it before. What that does is it creates an inventory put away document, or allows me to create an inventory put away document. So instead of now receiving against a PO, what I do is I generate an inventory put away, and that's my receiving document. I then go tell the system, where I'm putting this product, and when I post that put away, it posts the PO or transfer order that I'm receiving. Okay. Now the trick with this is I said, these things work independently, and that one works independently. I can turn it on and off without impacting anything else. But if I have require receive turned on, all of a sudden my put away is no longer a inventory put away. It is now a warehouse put away, and it is mandatory. Okay, so it went from being optional when this require receive is off, now being mandatory, and now also being something called a warehouse put away, which is very, very different than an inventory put away. So you see the confusion that you can generate when you start going through these options. And that's why it's good to figure out what the internal physical processes are. So just on the topic of put aways here, if the receiver is actually, he's got a box of product that comes in, and he picks up that box and he walks through the parts room or the warehouse, and he drops that product off into the places it needs to be, and then he says, I'm done, and that's when you post the receipt, then an inventory put away is the right way to go. If you want to receive everything into stock, and then later that afternoon you're going to put everything away, you're going to want a warehouse put away. But in order to do that, you also need to enable warehouse receipts. So again, identify the physical processes, then figure out which checkboxes you need to turn on to match those processes. Okay. Now, put away worksheet I'll talk about later. Require pick is the same thing. With this turned on sort of on its own like that, that actually just means allow pick. I don't have to use picks, even though it says require, but it allows me to create an inventory pick if I want. So it allows me to create a separate pick document for sales orders or production orders or transfer orders or whatever I want to actually pick the product out of stock for that specific document. When I post that inventory pick, it actually posts the source document. So for example, if it's a pick for a production order, when I post that inventory pick, it will actually post the consumption. Okay. So again, it's that matter of figuring out what the appropriate physical process is and then mapping it. Now, if I turn on require shipment, now we get into that whole warehouse document thing. As soon as I turn on require shipment, this pick now is no longer an inventory pick, it becomes a warehouse pick. And it works very, very differently again from an inventory pick. And I'll go into the differences on that a little later. And then finally, the bin mandatory, which is really your first decision, is do I want to make bins mandatory or not? You can have bins, and a lot of people don't realize this, you can actually have bins associated with an item that aren't mandatory. So for example, I could have item 1000, the bicycle, and I could list 4 bins that item is stored in. But without bin mandatory on, that's really just informational. I know that there's 4 bins that item 1000 can live in, but I don't know which bins it's actually in. I just know that those are 4 bins. So that can be useful in some environments where you don't need that, control over the quantities per bin, but you might want to know where that item can be located in multiple places. And the shelf number on the item card isn't sufficient because it's only 10 characters. And, it's not going to allow you to list, 5 different places for that particular item. Okay, but the bin mandatory is really your first decision. So why is that? Because this sort of is the framework for how you're going to use the warehouse. So I mentioned earlier that it's a decision between control and information. And the control means that I know exactly what quantity of product I have in what bin. And we can extend that further and say I know exactly which serial numbers or lot numbers I have in each bin. But the basics are, with that bin mandatory, I know where the product is in the warehouse. If I don't have that turned on, I can use a shelf number on the item card or the stock keeping unit card to indicate where that product lives. But it's not going to tell me how many of that product are in that particular spot in the warehouse. I don't like to use the word location, that spot in the warehouse. So why would we do that? When do we want to use mandatory bins? Generally speaking, if I can have the same product in multiple places in the warehouse, such as maybe an overstock location and a pick location, or I've got some, in the production area, at a specific work center or a sort of point of use consumption area, something like that, and also in the parts room or the warehouse, but anywhere where I might have that same item in the warehouse in multiple places, that's a good candidate for enabling bins. Because if I'm going out and doing a pick and this item might live in 2 or 3 different places, I want the pick to tell me exactly which bin has stock, enough stock to pick from.
Hey, Mark, I got a question here.
Sure.
The question is, can we disassociate to generate pick from the production order for component when require pick and require receive?
So let me see if I understand that.
Sorry, and there's actually a secondary kind of related question from the same person. Actually, we must pick item before consume them. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So There's a couple of things there, and we'll get into it when we get into the warehouse documents a little more, but you really have three options on production orders. You can just use production order picking list, which is not a formal thing. It's just a report that says these are the things you need to grab for the production order. You can use an inventory pick, but that's a single stage thing. As soon as I post that pick, it posts the consumption at that point. So that might be what you need. If, however, you want to do manual consumption or backflush consumption, and you want to enforce a pick at the same time, you have to use a warehouse pick for that, okay? Because what that will do is, it won't let you consume unless you've completed the pick. So until the pick is registered, the pick doesn't actually post consumption or anything else. You have to either do backflushing or manual consumption after you've completed the pick. So those are really your three options on production orders.
Okay, and I had another question jump in here from Joshua. Can we have bin mandatory in item level, not location level?
Okay, I'll get to that in 2 seconds. I just wanted to tell you that I lied on my previous answer. There's another option which is dumb, and I'll talk about why I don't like it. But there's also, for production orders, there's also an inventory movement, depending on how you're set up. So you can do an inventory movement to a dedicated bin rather than a pick. Is another option for doing essentially picking for production orders, but movements are done. Inventory movements are done. All right, bins are at the location level. I have seen modifications where they have done, bin mandatory at the item level, but it's not standard NAV. So bin mandatory is always at the location level unless you do a modification. Okay. I've also seen modifications for item tracking at the location level. So location A needs serial numbers, but location B doesn't use serial numbers. So I've seen that as well. But by default, it's at the location level. Now, so at any rate, just to recap, the reason you want to use mandatory bins, typically the primary driving criteria is I've got the same product in multiple places in the warehouse. If I've got, one pick bin for a product, everything has its spot on the shelf in the warehouse and I never put it anywhere else, bins may be overkill, right? Who cares? It's always put in that same place and I never have to worry about. Where you might want to look at enabling bins, even in an environment like that, is if people screw up and they keep putting stuff in the wrong place, right? So if we have an inventory accuracy issue where, I said it's on shelf number C2, that's always where it is. It's on the shelf number card or shelf number field on the SKU or the item card. It's always in C2, but some dummy is always putting it in C6 or something like that. Well, now you've got a problem because you go try to pick it. It's not where it's supposed to be. If you enable bins and then you enforce, with the scanning solution, you enforce people to scan the bin that they're actually putting it in, that's when you're going to improve your inventory accuracy and bins become useful, even in a situation like that. But otherwise, same product or same position for that product all the time, bins may be overkill. Okay. Even if you only rarely have overstock and things like that, bins may be overkill. The other options that I asked that question, stock keeping unit card I mentioned is one. If you have multiple locations, you would use that. And if you're not familiar with the SKUs, I wasn't really going to cover them, but the stock keeping unit is like a mini item card per location. It has a shelf number field, so that basically per location you can identify where that resides in the warehouse. So that's one option, the shelf number on the SKU or the item. And the other one, as I mentioned, is using bins. They're just not mandatory, so they become an informational field, or a list of bins become informational to tell you where that item might exist, but you don't know the quantity of each bin. Okay. All right. Any other questions on the bin side at all? No. Good. All right. Incidentally, these titles here, this is what happens when you do PowerPoints late at night. You think you're funny, and then, when the sun is shining, it's clear that it's more like, not that funny. Anyway, I still find it funny. So let's talk about the inventory and warehouse documents. So this is kind of what I covered off when we looked at that location card and the various options there. So again, we have 3 different ways we can generate documents, essentially pieces of paper now. When I say documents, a piece of paper for the warehouse to use to do picking and everything else. The The first is just a report. And this is what we find a lot of people use when they don't understand the capabilities of the NAV WMS options. So you go to a sales order and there's a pick instruction or a picking list by order on the sales order. So they print that out. It's just basically a report that goes against the sales lines and tells them what they need to pick. And a lot of people use that, and it's fine. Inventory documents. That's the inventory pick, inventory put away, movement, that sort of thing. That takes you one step further, where it separates you out away from the sales order or the purchase order or whatever a little bit, and gives you a separate area in NAV to do your work. And then finally, the warehouse documents, which is, the warehouse pick, warehouse receipt, those types of things. I talked about it earlier. The document choice does have a big impact, because if I'm dealing with inventory documents, I'm assuming that it's a one-stage process. When I finish my pick, I'm performing that end activity, like shipping. So as soon as I finish the pick and I post it, I'm shipping that product. It posts the sales shipment, or posts the consumption, or if I'm doing receiving, it posts the PO. Okay. Whereas warehouse documents give me a two-stage type of environment, where I pick, and then I can leave the product in the staging area and somebody else takes it and actually does the shipment. Okay, so the warehouse documents are two-stage, inventory documents are typically single-stage. And that has a big impact on how people actually work in the warehouse. So let's talk about reports a little bit. And reports are kind of one stage as well, though, they're kind of zero stage, but they do sort of similar to what the inventory documents do. So the various reports that are available for warehouse use or for material handling use. On the sales order, we've got, the pick instruction, the picking list by order. In older NAV, actually, if you're in the list, I think it gave you a pick instruction, and if you're on the document, it gave you the picking list by order for some reason. But both of those could be used for picking. The pick instruction, I think, is a newer, prettier one. So that, I think, is the default now. And all that is, like I mentioned, it just prints a list of sales lines, and away you go. On the production order, we've got the same thing. There's a picking list for a production order, and a material requisition is an option for figuring out what you need for that production order. If you're doing transfer orders, there's really no picking list or anything like that for transfer orders. You just have to print the transfer order document, and it actually does list the bin that product is in. For receiving and putting away that product off a transfer order, the only thing that's available is a transfer receipt report, and it doesn't list any bin information. So it doesn't tell you where it's supposed to go. It just says you've received this and you got to figure it out. And same thing with receiving. There's no real report that tells you where to put product after you've received it, if you don't have the inventory documents turned on. And one of the key things about these reports is they, except for I think the picking list by order maybe, they assume that bins are enabled. They assume bins are mandatory. So if you go in and you print a pick instruction for the blue location which doesn't have bins turned on, it'll list a bin field and it'll be blank because there are no bins defined in that location. So a lot of these reports assume that you're going to have bin mandatory, even though chances are if you're using these things, you don't have bins mandatory. You're using a shelf number or something like that. Okay. The other thing I'll mention, if you do enable bins, it's a little bit ironic, because if you do enable bins, you probably don't want to use these at all. And I'll tell you why in a sec. Like on a sales order, if you have bins enabled and you might have that product in more than one location in the warehouse, you almost certainly at that point want to go with an inventory pick document. Okay. And the reason is, if let's say I've got 10 of an item, 10 bicycles, and 5 in one bin, 5 in another, and I sell all 10 of those on a sales order. So I've got one line on the sales order, but I have to pick those items from 2 different bins. Well, unless you use an inventory pick or a warehouse pick, what that means is I'd actually have to have 2 lines on the sales order. One line for the product coming out of the first bin and a second line for the product coming out of the other bin. Well, nobody wants to do that. What you want is you want the sales order to have one line, and then your inventory pick to actually split out those lines across all the different bins. So if you go bin mandatory, you almost certainly at minimum want to enable inventory picks, and probably inventory putaways, but inventory picks for sure. Okay. The trick on the inventory documents, it's a one-stage thing. And like I said, as soon as you post that inventory document, it posts the source document. So post the sales order or whatever else it is. The other thing with the inventory picks and inventory put away and everything else is it's tied to a single source document. So I can't have an inventory pick that picks two sales orders simultaneously. Each pick is directly related to a sales order. So I'll show you what that looks like real quick. Right. So if we go in there, we go into departments. I'll show you in the departments menu rather than the role center. But if we go in there, we've got something goods handling order by order and goods handling multiple orders. Order by order is all the inventory documents. So inventory pick, put away, movement. Multiple orders is all the warehouse documents. So warehouse pick, warehouse put away, warehouse movement. So if I come in here, you'll see it says inventory picks, blah, blah, blah. If we do the multiple orders, it just says picks, put away is movement. So anytime you see inventory in front of it, that means you're doing it order by order, or you're using the inventory document, not the warehouse document. So if I go into inventory pick, and I've got one here, I'll just open it up. And you'd see very quickly, it's related to a specific sales order. So everything on here is related back to this sales order. So that's the inventory pick, and the inventory put away works the same way. There's a lot of little gotchas when you use this. So for example, if I didn't have stock in the warehouse to fulfill one of the lines on that sales order, it just wouldn't show up on that pick at all. It just wouldn't be there. So the pickers wouldn't even know that they need to look for it, which is good and bad. But you don't have that level of visibility that says, I've created a pick and these things are going to be picked short, because I didn't have stock of them. But I won't get into that level of detail here. But at any rate, the inventory picks related to a specific document. I'll jump ahead of myself a little bit since I'm in here. If we contrast that with a warehouse pick, so here's a warehouse pick. You notice the header doesn't reference a specific document. The lines actually reference the document. So I've actually got several sales orders on this particular pick document. And that can be sales orders for different customers, anything you like. It doesn't have to be for the same customer or anything else. So this allows you to do batching for that pick. All right, so the warehouse documents, two-stage process. So like a pick and ship process, I pick everything. When I register that pick, it's not called posting. When I register that pick, it just moves the inventory. It doesn't actually post the shipment. I then have to do a secondary operation to actually ship it. And that's basically everything that's on that slide. I was going to say something else there, but I forget what it is. Okay, we'll leave it at that. So let's jump in. I did get ahead of myself and show you that already. But the warehouse documents, oh, that's what I was going to say. The other thing on the warehouse documents is the fact that there's two lines for every activity. So you'll notice on this first line, it's for this LS120, these first two lines here, it's LS120, and I've got a take and a place activity. And that's what allows that two-stage shipping or receiving or whatever. So it's telling me to go to this bin and take 6 and then put 6 in this bin here. And this is my shipping bin, this W9 is my shipping bin. So that pick doesn't actually post the shipment. It just moves product out of my picking area to my shipping area. And then on the shipment, it's going to pull the product out of this bin onto the shipment. Okay. All right, so that's the warehouse documents. And again, we've got several of them in there: picks, putaways, and movements. Movements are generally only enabled for directed pick locations, but you can actually set them up to use the movement worksheet in non-directed locations as well. So for those of you who have more familiarity or a little more advanced, there is a very small modification that allows you to actually use the movement worksheet with non-directed pick locations. Okay. In contrast, this inventory movements, I said I'd explain why I think that's dumb. And the reason is it tries to do a two-stage activity where what it does is instead of let's say it's a movement for production. Instead of actually posting the consumption, it allows them to move product out of my pick bin into a dedicated production bin without actually posting consumption. Okay, so that's one reason, or one use for the inventory movements. The other one, which is where it does get done, is when we're doing assembly orders. So if we're doing assemble to order stuff, instead of generating a pick from a sales order, so I sell an assembly that has 3 components on it, and I say, hey, create me a pick for this. It won't actually create me a pick. It'll create a movement for me to move product out of my picking bins into my assembly bin, where I then assemble it and ship it. And the reason that's done is because for a sales order, I may have both an inventory pick and an inventory movement. So that's a real pain from an operational perspective to manage. I got 2 pieces of paper for the same thing. I'm just going to the warehouse, grabbing stuff and bringing it for that order. So inventory movements are a little dumb, but we're kind of stuck with them until somebody fixes it.
Hey, Mark, I got a question here.
Sure.
Can you please explain something about sorting method on warehouse pick?
Oh, sure. So yeah, I was messing with that. The sorting method is really a manual thing. When you create a warehouse pick, you get to choose. You can choose a sorting method at that point, but it really gives you a way of organizing your pick lines. So the default is blank, which is essentially the line number that it used. Most people either sort by bin or by bin ranking. And you sort by bin because then that's sort of the way you would walk through the warehouse if the bins are set up in a decent alphanumeric order. And bin ranking would be the other one, where you can say my most important bins are a higher rank than, say, my overstock bins. So you can have it sorted so that they go to the higher priority bins first, and then if those happen to be empty, it'll take you to the lower priority bins. That last statement wasn't 100% true, but close enough for this discussion. So really, this just controls how it's sorted. So if I sort by shelf or bin, you'll notice that it's now sorted by, I've got W01, W02, W02, so on and so forth, all the way through. Okay, so it's sorting by my take bin, so that in theory, this would be my logical path through the warehouse, right? Okay. All right. All right, so now let's talk about, sort of bin selection. If you have basic warehousing, in other words, you don't have the directed pick and put away checkbox turned on, the way the system selects the bin is very basic. It either uses the last bin that you did a transaction on, or it'll use the first fixed bin it finds for that item that has quantity. So it's not really doing any sort of logic or optimization or anything else. Really what it's going to do, if you set it to fixed bin, it's going to start at the first bin that it finds in alphanumeric sort order. It's going to find that first bin. It's going to say, okay, I can pick 3 out of here. Then it's going to go to the next bin, find 3 out of there, and so on and so forth until it's got everything it needs for that particular pick. So it's fairly basic, right? It's got no smarts associated with it whatsoever. There are a few additional options, like you can set up dedicated bins on production, so that that's not for choosing which bin to pick from. It's choosing which bin it gets delivered to. So when you create a pick from a production order, it'll set the delivery bin to the dedicated bin, and that's actually a movement, not a pick. And then the default warehouse bin, so receiving and shipping. So it does have a tiny bit of smarts, like if I've got product in my shipping or receiving bin, it's not going to let me pick from it, even if I only have the basic warehousing on. Okay. So the bin management is a big, discussion point when you're choosing between basic and advanced warehousing. So normally, I would say 80% of the people around there, just rough guess, that have the advanced warehousing turned on don't need it on. It's probably overkill for them, and it's probably causing them pain that they don't need to suffer. So when we turn that on, It basically forces all the other stuff on. It enables zones, which can be very handy. So without directed pick on, we can't logically group bins into zones. It disconnects the warehouse from the inventory subledger. And what that means is I can now do inventory adjustments in the warehouse, and my quantity on hand on the item card won't change because it doesn't actually create an item ledger entry when I do inventory adjustments in the warehouse. I have to do a secondary activity to actually bring those warehouse adjustments into the item subledger. All right. So that's both a pro and a con. You can have guys out there messing with inventory all over the place without hitting the item ledger until somebody approves it and then pushes it through to the item ledger. The downside is it's not necessarily as real time as what you'd expect. And you can have a mismatch. You can look at your bin contents and it says, oh, I got 100 in the bin, and your quantity on hand says 5, right? Because of that disconnect. And it also provides some tools to optimize the warehouse. So there are definitely pros to using this. And some of these tools, like the movement worksheet and things like that, small modifications, you can actually bring them down into the non-directed warehouse. It does enforce fairly specific processes as well. So you can't do things as easily as you can if you have that turned off. All right. So let's briefly look at the advanced warehouse options. So we'll go into the location code. The white location is the advanced warehouse. So you notice when we turn that on, it basically enables all of this and prevents me from doing it other than the put away worksheet. So that's one of the tools you can use to improve your efficiency. With this on, it allows you to sort of batch your putaways. You can go in and you spent the morning receiving. In the afternoon, you can decide what you actually want to put away. There's a few options as well. All of these are actually enabled in the basic warehouse as well, including the cross-dock, so that you can do automatic cross-docking. But really where we get into the advanced warehousing are, stuff on these two tabs here. So where we can specify an adjustment bin for those adjustments that aren't connected to the subledger. And then down here, there's a bunch of options we can use for the advanced warehousing. Always create pick line is only available if you have the directed pick and put away turned on. What that does is it eliminates that one issue that I talked about where I generate a pick for a sales order. If I didn't have stock, it just doesn't show up on that pick. I've got no visibility from the warehouse that there's other stuff on the sales orders that I don't have stock of. If we use this, and again, it has pros and cons, it'll always generate a line on the pick for me, even if I can't fulfill that in the warehouse. The pick according to FIFO is not directed pick required. That'll work on basic. The put away templates and the bin policies are all directed pick and put away. So if you want to control how much you can put in a bin, that sort of thing, the directed pick and put away will manage that for you. Just looked at the time. I've been talking way too much, so I'm way behind. All right, so when do you choose directed pick and put away? Number one, you have to have a fairly diligent workforce. They have to be aware of what they're getting into. It is a much heavier process. There's a lot more steps you have to go through to use directed pick and put away. There's a big difference if I come in here and if I go to oops, I hit the wrong thing. If I come in here and if this is turned off, right, and I come in here and I turn all these check boxes on, right, so it looks like directed pick and put away. So if I come in here and I turn all these on, this is all the same check boxes directed pick and put away was turned on. This works a lot differently than if I have this. It's all the same check boxes turned on, but as soon as I turn that on, I've got a whole different set of processes I need to deal with, right? I've got warehouse journals and warehouse physical inventory journals and things like that that I wouldn't have if I didn't have that turned on. All right, so first of all, diligent workforce, they have to, be capable of managing a more involved process. We have the same item in multiple bins where you want the system to be able to tell you where to put the product. So you get a pallet in, put that in overstock, and don't try and put that in a pick bin, right? That type of thing. Where your bins aren't fixed. In other words, I receive product in, I can randomly put it in anywhere in the warehouse. Well, a directed put away will do that for you. It'll find a spot in the warehouse for you to put that, even if you've never had that product in that bin before. So bins, non-fixed bins is a good use for directed put away. And if you want to do batch or wave picking. Now again, technically you can do this in non-directed, especially if you do modifications. But in the directed pick and put away, this gives you the ability, this gives you more tools to do batch and wave picking. And there's always a little bit of a terminology difference. So batch picking is where I combine multiple orders onto the same pick ticket. Wave picking is where I take the same order and I split it out into multiple pick tickets, right? So I have, 3 pickers going, each one takes an aisle and goes down there. They might all be picking the same order, but they've got 3 individual pick tickets. So we can do both of those with directed pick and put away, okay? Again, technically you can do some of that if you don't have directed pick and put away turned on, but it's much easier if you have the directed pick turned on. Right. Any questions on that at all? No. All right, and then when to say basic? Well, if none of those other things apply, then you stay basic, right? And again, I would say most people using NAV can stay with the basic warehousing with those various options turned on. They can do almost everything directed pick does, with the exceptions of these things on the previous slide here. Okay. If you tie that with a WMS system like ours or one of the other guys out there, then the basic system, the functionality ramps up quite a bit. And alternatively, the stuff that you do with directed pick gets simplified if you're using scanners in the warehouse versus paper-based tools. In fact, I would never implement directed pick and put away unless you had some sort of scanner, mobile type system that you could use on the shop floor or on the warehouse that's going to streamline some of those processes. All right. Wow. Yeah, I'm running way behind. So I'm going to zip through this. Item tracking also has a big impact on warehouse design. And the big one is really, do you want to track your lot and serial numbers by bin? There's lots of pros and cons to that. My normal gut reaction is don't do it, but there are definitely very good cases where you would want that done. If you want to know where the oldest product is, the first expired, first out, is in a bin, you need that warehouse item tracking turned on. If you're worried about recalls, so if you get a recall and you have to go hunt down those lot numbers or serial numbers, that's a good use for it. But otherwise, you have to really balance the fact that you've now got an extra piece of information you have to manage. Not only do you have to manage item and bin, you now have to manage serial number or lot number. So you need 3 pieces of information to do a transaction in NAV. Whereas if you turn off the warehouse lot tracking, that 3rd piece of information is a lot more flexible, okay, which is the lot or serial number. All right. I won't go through the item tracking configuration, but there is a checkbox on there that specifies warehouse serial or warehouse lot tracking, and that allows you to see which lot numbers and serial numbers are available in each bin. There aren't great tools in NAV. They've got a fact box on the bin contents, which now allows you to see lot numbers by bin, but otherwise it's actually kind of painful to see which serial numbers or lot numbers are in a specific bin.
Hey, Mark. Got a question from Robert. He's asking, so are you saying that unless necessary, just capture at receipt and shipment?
No, not necessarily. Lots of people do that. You can still capture the lot numbers, so I'll use lot numbers instead of lot and serial. You can still capture the lot numbers and keep them in stock from cradle to grave. But do I really care which lot number is in a specific bin, right? I've got 20 lot numbers in stock spread across 3 bins. Do I really care which bin holds which lot number? Most of the time, people don't. But they get, into the fact that they need to turn on that warehouse lot tracking. And when they do that, especially if you're not using a scanner type solution, it gets very painful to manage that data. Okay. So if you don't turn on that warehouse lot tracking, I still know I've got 10 lot numbers in stock. I still know I have, all this product spread across 3 different bins. And when I pick it, I say I'm picking this product out of this bin, and it happens to be this lot number. If you have the warehouse lot tracking turned on, you also have to make sure that that lot number was actually coded to that specific bin. If it wasn't, even though it's there physically, NAV is going to yell at you. So it's a lot more data management. And actually, that's a good question into this. The inventory counting. Again, if you have directed pick turned on, you actually need to use a warehouse physical inventory journal. It adds a little bit of additional pain and causes some problems, like you can't use the last inventory count date on the item card and things like that. So I don't like it. We have an add-on that addresses all of those sorts of issues, the inventory count add-on, advanced inventory count, which is a must-have if anybody's got a lot of inventory. But the other thing about it is if I'm only recording lot numbers on receipt and shipment, or maybe just on shipment, then there's no point in counting lot numbers when you go through your inventory count. So we have some people that don't want to turn on lot-specific tracking because they want to do things in the warehouse that they don't want to record lot numbers when they do them. But if that's the case, you don't want to enable the lot tracking on inventory adjustments, because it makes no sense to actually count those lot numbers, because NAV doesn't track lot numbers, like it doesn't override the application entries. What that means is, let's say I buy lot number A, then I buy lot number B, and this is assuming you don't have lot-specific tracking turned on. So in other words, I'm capturing a lot number at receiving and maybe at shipping. But if I buy lot number A, and then I buy lot number B, and then I sell lot number B, what's going to happen to stock? It's actually going to take lot number A out of stock, and it's going to show that I have stock of lot number B. So that's standard NAV behavior, and most people don't realize it does that. Okay, the only way you can track what lot numbers you actually have in stock is by turning on lot-specific tracking, and that's not the same as warehouse lot tracking. Lot-specific tracking just means I need to specify a lot number on every single transaction I do. And then one step up from that is the warehouse lot tracking, which tells me which bin that lot number is in. All right. And that's it. So you should be really smart now, hopefully, and be able to sort of explain some of these configurations, or at least understand that the fact that there is a fair amount of complexity when we talk about NAV warehousing. And in general, most of the time, I would say, probably want to stay away from directed pick and put away. There are very, very good reasons to turn that on, but I personally think it's overused in a lot of cases.